Is it possible for busy people to really find time for reflection in their life? Hello, my name is Michelle Bleiberg, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I'm delighted to be sitting down with Joseph Badaracco to discuss his latest book, which is called Step Back. Joseph, I have to admit, when I first received your book to read, I thought, oh no, another book I'm not going to be able to apply to my life because I'm probably one of the typical people that you interviewed and spoke with who finds it really difficult to fit in time for reflection in their life. But I have to say, I was very pleasantly surprised. Your book is not a roadmap about how to meditate and find 30 minutes a day to set aside, but instead is filled with thoughtful suggestions based on an amazing amount of research you did about how busy people really do find unique ways to find time for reflection. In your opening, I like that you said, and I quote, "In the end, I concluded that busy, responsible men and women do make time to reflect, but not during extended periods of solitude. They rely instead on what I came to call mosaic reflection." And of course, we know a mosaic is artwork made from small pieces of stone or glass, and busy people practice the art of reflection in the cracks and crevices of their everyday lives. What a great quote from your book. However, what I particularly admire about this book is that it's not just about thinking and reflecting, but it's a guide as to really how to deepen your inner life and lead a more fulfilling and meaningful life. And it's as much about thinking as about doing. So, Joseph, you are a well known professor at Harvard. You particularly focus on ethics and leadership and character. You've published many impressive books. Tell me, please, what inspired you to write Step Back? How to bring the art of reflection into your busy life?
Well, Michelle, I wish I could pinpoint a particular moment that was kind of a catalyst. Uh, I, but I can't. On the other hand, I became increasingly aware that I was advising students, executives occasionally, to spend more time reflecting. And people would give me that advice. I think almost everybody listening probably has gotten the advice and given the advice. And what I became aware of is how infrequently that advice is accompanied by any specifics about what reflection is and how busy people actually find time to do it. So I decided it would be interesting to investigate and see if busy people did reflect, and if they did, how they did. And I thought this would be interesting in two ways. Number one, I thought I might learn something useful. And at Harvard Business School, a lot of our educational programs are aimed at being useful, at helping people run things, run them better. But there was also an interesting kind of intellectual question behind this. What is reflection? So I was kind of grabbed by those two things, the prospect of almost writing what you might call a how to do it book, but also really understanding more about reflection. So I started down the road of the interviews and the reading.
Well, thank you for that. And why does it really matter that we reflect on our lives? Like, how does this really help us in life?
Well, uh, at the end of this effort, I concluded that reflection is really a kind of universal tool. It's like a Swiss Army knife. It can be used for a vast range of questions, topics, problems. Some of them are small, but you step back because you think something might be going in the wrong direction. You've got to decide whether you want to give somebody a big bonus or a small bonus. And you need to just pause and put that in a larger context. So you can call that, if you want, just kind of a micro reflection. Then there's other big questions. Do I change jobs? Do I let somebody go? The kinds of big questions that come up in home life. You've got an elderly parent. When can't they? When do you decide they can't live on their own anymore? And for a vast range of questions in between, the big ones and the small ones, it's really valuable to step back and reflect. That's assuming, of course, that you reflect in the right way. And I don't mean, and the book doesn't say that there's a single right way to do it. But if you study, as I did, the classics of reflection, these are works that have been around for centuries or millennia, you find there are certain basic approaches to good reflection. And so what I tried to do in the book was explain these fundamental approaches in a simple, practical, straightforward way, and then describe all the different ways in which the people I interviewed found time, brief periods of time, as you pointed out, to actually do this kind of reflecting. So it's valuable across the board if you do it right.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the research of your book because I have to say, I think that's another thing that really differentiates your book from a lot of typical how to, meditate or reflect in life. And I learned a tremendous amount through the many citations you make in your book. And one of them that I thought was really interesting was a past Roman emperor, who I have to admit not being familiar with, Marcus Aurelius.
Aurelius, yes.
Aurelius, and I mean, he reigned during another time, as we'll talk about later, of a pandemic called the Antonine Plague, which took 5 million lives. And during this time when he reigned, he found time during a war period where he would write, and I guess at the time he may not have thought of it as a journal, but later I understand after his death, when they found this piece of work and published it, they called it Meditations, and I guess this is really one of the very first examples of journaling. Although I understand from your book, he called it Spaces of Quiet. And he was one of the original practitioners of what you refer to as Mosaic reflection. Tell us about the kind of research you did to write this book, and in particular, the study that you did among managers and executives.
Sure. I should mention, by the way, that there's speculation. No one, of course, knows for sure that Marcus actually died of the plague himself. Uh,
Oh,
he lived the last 10 years of his life and worked in miserable conditions up in the north of Italy, what's southern Germany now, fighting a battle, leading soldiers against an invasion. During that time, he had other pressing issues as emperor, financing the Roman government, plotting against him back in Rome. So he was, it's an understatement to say this, he was a very busy guy with a lot on his mind. But every few nights, he would sit down, presumably by candlelight, and write a few lines in this little book, which miraculously survived. He didn't intend for it to survive. He was just trying to collect his thoughts. But what's critical to understand about his approach is that it's an example of what I call Mosaic approach, the Mosaic approach to reflection. And that is the opposite of, I think, the classic view of reflection, which is you go by yourself for an extended period of time in solitude, maybe with guidance from a wise thinker or a religious person of some kind. These were just little fragments of time, probably in between reports from generals and others, and probably wanted to get to sleep like everybody else does at some point at night. Uh, he was practicing Mosaic reflection, but he reflected well. And of course, he was an extraordinary individual, but he managed to use these little fragments of time in ways that really worked for him. And that's what I discovered as I started doing the interviews. So I ultimately interviewed about 100 people, almost all of them managers at various levels in organizations, ranging from entry level to CEOs, including some CEOs of companies that I'm sure everybody listening has heard of. And the funny thing was, when I started the interviews, uh, several people came in kind of apologetically and said, "No, I'm glad to talk with you, but I'm not the right person because I really don't reflect." And what I discovered was that what they meant by reflection was this classic approach, this go to the mountain approach to reflection. And I think they felt guilty that they didn't do it. They felt they should do it, but they thought that's what I wanted to talk about. And they thought this was going to be sort of a 5-minute polite meet and greet, and it would be over. Turned out I just got them to talk a little bit about when they did step back, what they thought about, what they did regularly. And it turns out that everybody I interviewed, virtually everybody, had put together their own distinctive personal pattern of small moments of reflection. And so it might be a combination. Some people did it in a little reflecting in the car while they were driving. Some people did it, men would say they're doing it while they're shaving. Some people did it while they were cooking. Some people tried to take 5 minutes before they went to sleep. There were these little pockets of reflection, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if things were going pretty well. When they stepped back, they paused and tried to think in more depth about something that was on their minds or that was important to them. So Marcus Aurelius really was kind of a practitioner. I guess he discovered through his own trial and error efforts the same things that these managers and executives had discovered, that they needed to reflect, that it was valuable, but they had to customize a way to do it in small moments of time that fit with the rest of their lives.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And what I really like about the beginning of the book is the very first concept you talk about is a concept called good enough. And that seems to relate to what you just shared, that people don't necessarily have this typical, let's go to the mountain and find solitude in order to reflect, but that you can actually find time throughout your life in different kinds of ways that are good enough. Can you share a little bit about this good enough concept?
Sure. One good way to introduce it is with a quote that starts the book. It's from a very successful investor, a private equity investor. And of course, he would sit on the board of a number of the small companies that his firm was financing, and he'd spend time with typically young people who were running these companies, and they were novice executives in many cases. And he told me that what he told them was, look, if I ever come into your office and find you with your feet up on your desk and you're staring out the window, I'm going to double your salary. In other words, he's not going to fire them, he's going to double their salary. What he was saying, I actually got him to explain this uh, piece of advice he gives. And he said, these folks running these companies spend their whole time putting out fires, trying to get these companies off the ground. And if they can just find a little bit of time and do a little bit of reflecting, thinking about where the business is going, are there some real issues, personnel? Do we really need to think about pivoting because we haven't been able to make the big customers we got at the beginning? All these questions, bigger questions. He wanted them to take a little bit of time to start thinking about these things. He didn't want them to go off for a weekend retreat with their senior executives and create a lot of PowerPoint slides and do a strategic review. All he wanted was, in effect, good enough reflection. And there's a saying, various versions of this saying, that if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing really well. And I think the opposite is true for some other things like reflection. And if they're worth doing partially. They're worth doing not as often as you'd like to be doing them. They're worth doing not perfectly, but pretty well, because you will make progress and you will get a benefit. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of the people I spoke with were apologetic because they said they didn't reflect. Even when they were aware that they were doing these small mosaic approaches to reflection, they still would say, but I don't do it often enough, and I really should get up in the morning and write in a journal. That typically wasn't going to happen. But the book is really organized around what I call 4 design principles for the art of reflection. And reflection is an art. And every art has its kind of broad design principles. If you're composing music or painting, you learn design principles, and then you fill in the specifics. And the first one here, the most important one, is find a good enough approach. And by that I mean find something that you can do fairly often, that helps you make progress. Ideally, it's something you enjoy doing. That raises the odds that you're going to do it more often. Ideally, it's something that's kind of associated with or piggybacked on some other activity you do regularly. So a surprising number of people reflected while they exercised. And it wasn't accidental reflection. They actually planned on thinking through a topic while they were running or something like that. So good enough means it works for you most of the time and you make progress, and then put aside any perfectionist or Olympian standards. There's another saying I like, which is that the better is the enemy of the good. And if you've got something that's good, work on it, try and do it a little better, but declare victory and pat yourself on the back.
Well, Joseph, I'm glad you mentioned these the design principles of yours because I thought they were a very helpful way to enjoy the book. And the first one that you talk about is called Downshifting. And I like the metaphor you use of a race car as we're sort of racing through life. These are my words, perhaps not yours, that we should downshift and slow down a bit. And in that first section of the book, you talk about many ways. Some of them weren't surprising to me. Things like journaling, which we talked about already, ways to purposely slow down, including walking slowly, the opportunity to enjoy nature, whether you're looking at a picture of nature or you actually go outside and have a cup of coffee. But some of them were very surprising to me. And one of them that I had never thought about before as a form of reflection, I'd love you to talk about, which is the idea of celebrating. How does celebrating help you reflect?
Well, it's really a valuable form of reflection. Um, I think a very common view of reflection is it's sort of serious or somber, and you do it when you've got a crisis or a problem, or you've failed and you want to learn lessons so you're less likely to fail in the future. And those are important things to do. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But celebration is also a form of stepping back and pausing. But instead of looking at problems, it's looking at successes, yours, and in some of the people I talked with, a team's success. And one guy put it pretty well. He's a very well informed executive, and he knew a lot about Japanese kaizen, continuous improvement. And he said it's a great way to run a factory, a great way to run a business. And you want people trying to do things better and better all the time. But he said that's a terrible way to live all the time, and that you need to stop at some point and look at where you've succeeded, not to analyze the success, not to find lessons for future success, just to say, we did it. He said, just sort of like polish the certificate a little bit. We did this. It was hard. It worked. We should all smile a little bit. And that is a form of this kind of downshifting reflection because it, you use the analogy of the race car. And I think our minds, if you're running something, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. You try to solve each one. You get to the heart of it, you try to crack the case, move on to the next one. And this is sort of pulling yourself out of that mental framework. And celebrating is one way of doing it because it does pull back. Behind each of these three design principles, and I think we'll end up talking about each one, you're really trying to seek kind of depth. And with downshifting, the aim is sort of depth of experience. In other words, what's happening now, or what has happened, what's happening out there in the world, what's happening at a meeting, what am I feeling or thinking? You're trying to really grasp that in depth and figure out what really matters. And that does require slowing down a little bit, pausing, stepping back, and seeing what comes up. And a number of people said that their creative moments often occurred to them when they weren't trying to solve one of the endless series of problems that's on the conveyor belt you work on if you're a manager. Uh, but they had paused, and then this is one of the angles on running that several of the interviewees came up with their own. It's sort of like you take part of your brain power and it monitors the running, and that frees up another part of your brain to sort of display other things that you've your unconscious mind has been working on, and they pop up. I think Einstein was said to have come up with parts of the theory of relativity while he was riding on his bicycle. So our minds are complicated things. And this downshifting says, look, at the beginning, you just have to move out of this laser focus on what's happening now and what do I have to do and what's next on my to-do list, and ease up a little bit. You mentioned, I'll just give one more example. The woman who was running this huge staff, I think it was like 1,500 people. And of course, she could have endless meetings in her office. From time to time, she would schedule a meeting in someone else's office and schedule extra time to get there. There was a CFO of a company who didn't know the woman, actually described themselves as doing the same thing. And in both cases, they just walked slowly to the next meeting. They weren't managing by walking around. They weren't checking people, saying hi, building morale. They were just trying to do something physical more slowly. And if you look at the great traditions of reflection, you look at religious reflection, people kneel to pray. If you look at Asian meditation, you get into the lotus position or something like that. So downshifting isn't just flipping a switch in your mind. It often means you've got to do something physical. This, by the way, is what the private equity guy was saying. If I catch you with your feet on the desk looking out the window, that's also a physical change. It's trying to break away from constantly looking at people at meetings and constantly looking at a computer screen, which is what we are locked into all the time, and then seeing what comes up. Or you can do more than just see what comes up, because there's some people who are kind of uncomfortable with this whole idea of just sort of letting your mind run free. They think it's going to, some of the interviewers, I can't do that. It's going to raise my blood pressure. But there's other things you can do. You can ask yourself certain questions. You can look out the window. You can listen to music. There's a lot of different approaches. And again, coming back to good enough, you got to find one that works pretty well for you. And the odds are that you're already doing something along these lines. You haven't paid much attention to it. But if you, over the course of a couple days, look for the moments when you sort of downshift your mind and relax a little bit, reflect a little bit, notice where you are, what you're doing, see if you can do that a little more often. It's probably part of your life, but try to integrate it a little bit more fully. Then you're doing this first classic form of reflection, which used to be, in the old days, it was called contemplation. I use downshifting just as a more everyday contemporary way of describing it. It's the same thing. It's just letting this muscle called your brain relax a little bit.
Well, maybe this is a good time. We'll give our audience that opportunity to do it, and maybe everyone can pause for a moment, take a deep breath. And we're going to give ourselves an opportunity to take a short break for some quick announcements. We'll be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Joseph Badaracco, the author of Step Back.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, and welcome back to our conversation with Joseph Badaracco on our book, Step Back. So, Joseph, the second design principle that you talk about is called pondering. And I like your definition of pondering. You tell us in the book that pondering is trying to grasp what really matters about an issue or a problem by coming back to it again and again and looking at it from a variety of angles. Pondering supposes that hard issues have different facets and angles, and each is worth some consideration. You later say, looking at a problem or question from different perspectives may sound easy, but we know it isn't. And often when we think about reflecting, it seems like a time to sort of, zone out and give yourself time. But in this area of the book, you talk about that it's really a time to ponder some of the more difficult issues people are facing in life. Um, you mentioned in particular the idea of anchoring questions and how people can use those. Can you give us an example of an anchoring question and how can they help us go deeper?
Sure. Let me also underline something important that you said, Michelle, and that is that people often think that reflection is kind of zoning out. And I think by and large that isn't true. And if you look at the classics of reflection, there's very little in there that describes anything like zoning out. And sometimes, and this is the case with pondering, reflection really is a kind of thinking. It's a kind of conscious thinking. But it's a change in what I think is our ordinary way of thinking, which is here's an issue, what's really going on, what's important, how do I get to the bottom of it, and what do I do? Those are the basic ways managers approach issues, either by themselves or with other people. Pondering basically says that the complicated issues, the kind that get delegated upwards in organizations, have lots of different sides to them. And before you really understand what's going on, you've got to look at them from a variety of different perspectives. And that's what pondering is. It's turning something over in your mind. So I interviewed one executive who had the opportunity to go back to his home country in a very senior government position. And he felt a certain amount of patriotic loyalty, even though he had lived outside his country for something like 20 years. Of course, this was a great professional opportunity. And he had an elderly father that he wasn't seeing often enough, who lived back in the city where this executive would be working if he took the government job. And there were two ways in which he sort of pondered the issue. One was he tried to imagine as vividly as he could what his work life would be like, who he would be meeting with, what the topics would be, what the analytical work would be that had to get done, what the political circumstances were in which this meeting would be taking place, and tried to get a sense of whether he had a positive or negative reaction to this. It was like he was trying to watch a video in his mind of what his day by day life would be like. And he also did this briefly just with the rest of his life. And of course, seeing his father more often was terrific. Where would he live? Where would he commute? What would be the impact on his family? So, one way to look at things from another perspective is to stop looking at the big, long term, abstract angle on them and try to get down to the everyday, gritty, lived sort of experience. Another very good example, and I suspect some of the listeners will be familiar with this, says instead of looking at this issue from your perspective, your responsibilities, how's your boss going to think about whatever you do? Try and ask yourself how it would look from the perspective of somebody you admire, maybe a professional role model, maybe a personal role model. How would they think about the problem? What would they think would be important? What might they be inclined to do? What might be some of the boundaries around what they would do, things they would and wouldn't do? This is getting as best you can. Again, you're using your imagination, trying to see it from the perspective of someone else. And as I said, somebody whose admiration and respect really sort of matters to you. That's what pondering is really all about. It's trying to escape from whatever the initial perspective and framing that you start with and making sure you're seeing things in a deeper context. I said that reflection is trying to really grasp what's important, what's fundamental. With downshifting, it's trying to grasp what's important about your experience. This is trying to really understand in depth. It's not experience. This is a form of thinking, and it's really trying to understand things in depth. And your immediate thought and your immediate framing is often not the right way to do that.
Well, that's very interesting. And that I think leads perfectly to what I think is another unique approach you bring up around reflecting, which is more of an action-oriented approach in your final design principle, which you called pause and measure up. And here you pose two very important questions. The first is, are my decisions and actions measuring up to the standards I've set for myself and the standards others expect me to meet? And the second question being, as I make decisions and act, am I becoming the kind of person I want to be? And you describe that it's often hard for us to see ourselves as we truly are. And one of the techniques is to rely on companions and guides. Now, this to me is very interesting because I think most people probably think about reflection as a solitary activity. And here you suggest another unique way that you can actually reflect while interacting with others.
Yes, that was one of the really interesting findings. Like almost everybody else, I think I was inclined to think of reflection as solitary activity, but I would guess that a quarter to a third of the people I interviewed said that they reflected on serious issues, professional and personal, with other people. In other words, they had conversations. By the way, there are a few people who had conversations with themselves. As I try to emphasize, people had created a vast range of ways to do this mosaic reflection and had found ways to work for them. And some, they didn't do this like when they were riding on the bus or walking down the hallway at work, back when we could walk down the hallways at work. They would actually talk aloud with themselves about an issue and try to bring out different perspectives. But for most people who relied on it, the conversational approach involved talking with another person. Now, this wasn't any other person, but there were often one, sometimes two people at work that they felt comfortable with. They could just kind of open up a little bit about what was on their minds. They didn't feel they were going to be immediately judged. The person they were talking with wasn't going to try to give them the answer. There was just a kind of climate of sort of openness and trust and security. And they felt that by going in and bouncing something off, to use the standard phrase, this person, they made progress. Sometimes on big issues, they might need half an hour. It's a small issue, a small HR issue. You might just go down the hallway, knock on somebody's door, 5 minutes. You get a little better perspective on things. But it is very hard for us to see ourselves. And this is a way of getting a semi-outside perspective. I say semi-outside because they were talking with people who knew them pretty well, and they were on the same wavelength to some significant degree with these people. So that can help you get a little clearer fix on what do you expect, what do other people expect you to do, and what do you want to do as you try to decide between option A, B, and C. Which of these is really going to help you measure up?
I also liked in your book, you talked about that sometimes people did it while driving in their car or calling somebody, and that often it was parents that people would turn to and talk through. And there's a lot of religious examples you use while people feel they can talk to a priest. It was very heartening to read the person that would call and talk to their mother or talk to their father and use trusted people in their lives as an opportunity to reflect with.
Well, there were actually two guys in their one guy I interviewed in his 30s told me about his brother who was older. He said they both called their mother every day and talked with her about all sorts of things. A woman who was not the same woman who did things slowly occasionally just to spend a little time downshifting. This is another woman who also ran a pretty big staff operation. Called her father on the way home from work most days, and he was a retired executive. And she talked about her day. Uh, and it wasn't so much, she wasn't getting answers from him because he didn't know what was happening, in her workplace and with the people who reported to her. But it was just a great environment for her to sort of talk things through. And this is a valuable way of sort of measuring up, not on your own, not by yourself.
Well, one of the things I liked about your book in particular is that you really make finding time for reflection achievable. One example that you shared is the woman who relied on a creative, personalized version of what most of us would think about a standard to-do list. And I could relate to this one, being a big fan of to-do lists every day. But in her story, I like that you showed that every morning she wrote down not only what she had to do and wanted to do that day, but she also included a short period of reflection and sometimes put a question in for herself or a saying that she wanted to find time to reflect on. And you
Hmm.
commented that she was actually creating a to live list, not just a to do list, because it nudged her to think briefly about her standards, her values. And while she was handling her task for the day, she could make her days more meaningful by also thinking about how she wanted to live. So I'm curious to ask you, how do you suggest that people might start if they want to add reflection to their lives?
Well, I think the best place to start is by trying to observe themselves. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, notice the times of day or night when they're not like 90 to 110% engaged in processing work issues. And notice what they're doing and how they're spending the time, what's going through their mind. I think almost everybody, this is based on my interviews with, in-depth interviews with about 100 people, actually has pockets of time like this. They may not be aware of them. They may not count them as reflection if they are aware of them. But step number one is sort of noticing them. I think step number two would be to see if you could do them a little better. And better means really relying on one of these three classic approaches to reflection. And the downshifting, pondering, measuring up. These aren't things I made up. Okay, you can trace the roots of these back for ages in religious, non-religious thinkers, political leaders. So if you find some moments when in the natural course of your busy day you are stepping back a little bit, then it becomes, especially if you don't have much time, becomes really important to use the time well. And that means deciding, okay, I'm just going to downshift a little bit in whatever way sort of works for you. Or here's a question I'm trying to think through. There's different ways of pondering. The book describes a bunch of different things I heard from the people I interviewed, or measuring up. Be more conscious of when you have the time, and then be more conscious of how you spend the time. And I think you'll probably find certain things work. It'll be easier to go back to them. You'll feel like you're missing something if you haven't done it for a while. And you get the snowball rolling down the hill a little bit.
Well, although I know you researched and wrote this book over the last 4 years, I can't help but think the timing of having it come out during the coronavirus is a very unique period. You've got more people working from home and possibly not having long commutes. And although many of us are probably busier than ever before, there certainly seems like a lot of critical things to be thinking and pondering about during this time. What is your thought on how it relates to the fact that your book is coming out now in July in the middle of a pandemic in our day and age?
Well, just briefly, there's the amazing coincidence that there were plagues raging at the time when all three of the classic writers I really studied were alive. This is Ignatius Loyola, Michel de Montaigne in the 1500s, and Marcus Aurelius, uh, in the first century. Uh, Plague then, though, was just sort of an ordinary part of the fragility of life. I think you can only you can't spend more than 90 seconds online or watching television without seeing an extraordinary number of things that really merit reflection. Uh, the heroism of the first line workers, the stunning number of deaths and serious illnesses, the personal aspect on this that, you a lot of people have the feeling that they go to the wrong place, breathe the wrong air. Their lives could be endangered, not just their lives, elderly parents worry about children going back to school. And then there's what's been happening in the streets, the protests and now the federal crackdowns on what's been going on. These are huge issues about this country, where it's heading, our role as citizens, how we live our lives. Do we put masks on? How often do we put masks on? There's just a lot to think about. I mean, it's almost impossible, I think. It seems weird to turn the clock back 6 months ago and realize that none of these things were really on the agenda. The things, there were big issues then, like would the GDP grow 2.8% or 3.2%? And was the market as high as it was going to go, or was it really on a roll? And the Dow was going to hit 30,000 or something. All that stuff has just been wiped off the slate. I think it all looks trivial compared to these issues that are both personal, national, societal, global, involving death, disease, race, it's all there. So there's a lot to think about, and a lot of people have less time to think because they're working at home. They've also in the spring and maybe in the fall are going to be trying to educate their kids at the same time. So being able to do some of this on a Mosaic basis and trying to do it right, really making the best use you can of your time for reflection, I think becomes even more important because there's so much that really is worth reflecting on. And who knows where we'll come down in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years once this is all passed. I have no idea, but even then there may be a lot to think about.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I want to thank you because the book was an incredible opportunity to rethink my own style. And I think that I'm going to commit to a to-live list instead of just a to-do list and be much more conscious about what I think about when I find those perhaps crevice moments of reflections that I take advantage of. I would like to thank our listeners today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or even explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org/podcasts. And they do have a fantastic selection to listen to. Again, thank you, Joseph, and I do hope that our readers will take advantage. Your book is just coming out now in July. Joseph, where can our readers find your book available?
Usual places, maybe I should say the usual place, Amazon.com.
Well, I do encourage you to go to Amazon.com because it is a short but very powerfully filled book with, again, not only some very practical ways that you can find time to build reflection into your life, but an amazing source of research. And thank you for that, Joseph. This is a book that you clearly spent a lot of time and effort writing, and I think it's going to be extremely useful to many of our readers. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle, and I enjoyed this.
I did too, and I hope everyone finds time to reflect on their lives.